You.
Thank you. Yep. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for being here. So I'm a device physicist, so I guess my talk is not going to be about systems, but rather about chips, even devices, and even the atoms or electrons inside the devices. So I'm going to talk about this spin transfer torque magnetic random access memory. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my coworkers at TDK Headway Technology in Milpitas, California. So this company, Headway Technologies, is part of the TDK Corporation. And Headway main core business is to build heads for disk drives, selling to the main hard disk drive manufacturers. But we are a sub-team of this company working, R&D team working on this magnetic random access memory technology. So you may have heard about magnetic random access memories. Actually, it's been around in its current iteration, it's been around for more than 20 years. The program was started at IBM and Motorola independently in 1995. And the first product actually was produced by a spin-off of Motorola, which now is called Everspin in 2006. So back then, the storage device was written using actually the magnetic field by large currents flowing through lines. So this cross-point architecture was used using applying current through those lines and to create these pretty significant fields at the device level. So that's not really scalable, and the power is also quite high, and the architecture is not all that easy either. So this was kind of abandoned mostly, although you can still buy some product, but it's pretty much a niche market. Prior to this iteration, actually, magnetic random access memory were the core memories of computers. So some of you may know about these magnetic core memories, which were the predominant computer memory back in the 50s and 60s. So which were actually quite amazing devices, or little magnetic cores where with copper wire threaded all across these little cores to write, read, and address these memories. So it was displaced by the advent of CMOS technology. So let's move on to the current version of magnetic random access memory we're working on, STT-MRAM. So this is the outline of my talk. I will discuss quite a bit of the basic principles of the technology to give you some flavor of what it is all about, discuss a little bit about the integration, and some discussion about how this technology fits in the emerging memory landscape. So the device at the heart, really the building block of this technology is so-called magnetic tunnel junction device, so which is basically made of 3 layers, 2 magnetic layers and an insulating barrier in the middle. And these layers, one acts as a polarizer, one as an analyzer, basically. So it behaves as a spin filter. If you have the 2 magnetization parallel to each other, the current is flowing easily. It's a low resistance state. If you have the magnetization anti-parallel to each other, the current has much harder time flowing through the device. It's a high resistance state. So these structures are here. You see some cross-sectional transmission electron microscopy micrographs of this structure. And it turns out that the structure and the crystal structure of the structure is quite important. So you see here a very beautiful layer by layer, almost arrangement of the iron MgO iron structure, which was used to demonstrate high change in resistance back in 2004. So there has been quite some work actually to achieve this structure and to get the tunnel magnetoresistance, which is basically the readout signal in these structures. So again, the ratio of resistance in the anti-parallel and parallel orientation. And starting from the 1975, with only 14% at room temperature, reached about 100% in the early 2000s, so which is basically a factor of 2. It's not a huge on-off ratio for sure. And by changing the material from alumina to magnesium oxide, people were able to demonstrate up to 600% in some of these structures, which is factor of 6. Still not all that great if you think in terms of on-off ratio of semiconductor technology, but it starts to be reasonable. Unfortunately, the TMR is not the only parameter we need for these memories. We need also non-volatility, data retention to have a memory. So for this, we use a phenomenon called perpendicular magnetic anisotropy, which arises at the interface between the MgO oxide layer that you see here in white and the magnetic electrodes, which appear dark here. So this PMA is really an interfacial effect. So to increase it, we basically use two MgO barrier to have twice the effect, basically. And this perpendicular magnetic anisotropy allows to get enough data retention to scale the devices down to way sub 100 nanometers devices, down to, depending on the data retention needed, down to maybe 20 nanometers or so. So there's also another caveat in this structure is that we have one storage layer and one reference layer. And the magnetostatic is such that if you magnetize those things in the perpendicular direction, there will be a large field from the storage from the reference layer, the so-called pin layer, which will basically bias the properties of the storage layer, which is not what we want. So we need to use this kind of so-called synthetic antiferromagnetic structure where we use two layers coupled in an anti-parallel manner. And this can be done by using material science, but it turns out that the resulting structure is becoming quite complicated. So you see this is an example of a structure published by Tohoku University back in 2014. This is pretty typical of what kind of structure we're using now. So it can involve up to more than 20 layers. And some of these layers are only a few atoms thick. You see here it's only 3 angstrom of tantalum, for example. And you have to keep in mind this must be done on a 12-inch wafer with perfect uniformity. So this is, in terms of material science, quite a feat. But it can be done. It's been done, actually. So now we can actually demonstrate very high data retention thanks to these two MGO layers, which allows us, in this case, which was a big collaboration with our partners at TSMC, it's a big foundry in Taiwan. So for this technology, E-flash replacement, we need to satisfy solder reflow requirements. Doesn't sound like much, but we need to get the data stable at 260 C for 90 seconds. And magnetics, unfortunately, tend to degrade with temperature. Everything goes bad with temperature. So achieving this basically guarantees you a huge data retention at lower temperature. So we managed to do that, and we end up having a 10-year data retention for 1 part per million error at 225 C, which is way beyond whatever any really, even automotive application don't need all that much. So data retention is not an issue. We can really make it pretty good. So let's move on to discuss a little bit with this device, this MTJ device. So here I show the resistance of a typical device as a function of magnetic field applied perpendicular to the plane of the wafer. So you start from an anti-parallel state, which is basically your high resistance state. And moving the field downward in the opposite direction, we can reach the parallel state. And when we remove the field, we end up with this P state. So we have these two well-defined parallel and anti-parallel state, low and high resistance, your two logic state for your memory. And this is quite different from a typical SRAM or DRAM. This is really a resistive device with these two well-defined resistance states giving you your two logic states. And the nice thing about these MTJ devices is that there's no drift in resistance. These two distribution of resistance before and after endurance test, where you apply very large right current through the device to try to stress the devices as much as you can, there's absolutely no drift. There might be some breakdown, but there's no drift. So these states remain very, very well defined all during the lifetime of the memory, basically. So that's for the read. Now what about the write? So I talked earlier about the field, the magnetic field, which was used back in the late 90s to write these devices. It doesn't scale very well. So what we're using actually is this so-called spin transfer torque, which was discovered in '96 independently by two theoreticians from IBM and Carnegie Mellon. And basically, it's based on the idea that the current flowing through the device, which is carried by the conduction electrons, acquires some spin polarization in one electrode. And when it tunnels into the second electrode, its spin will realign eventually to be along the second electrode magnetization. And this realignment, this transfer of spin angular momentum, exerts a torque on the magnetization. So these are not the same electrons that carry the current and that carry the magnetization. It's basically conduction and valence electrons. So this spin transfer torque is such that you can just pass current through the device, and if the current density is high enough, you can switch either to the P state or to the anti-parallel state if you exceed some critical current or voltage. So basically, it's somewhat similar to the tunnel magnetoresistance I was discussing earlier. It's some kind of a parallel effect in a way. So we use tunnel magnetoresistance to read the device, and this spin transfer torque to write the device, P state or AP state. So the specificities of this spin transfer torque has some consequences for the devices, for the properties of the devices, which are, I think, important to realize to build systems with those devices eventually. So one thing is that basically the switching current scales with area. We need a constant current density to switch those devices, which is good and bad. I mean, the good thing is that you make smaller devices. By definition, you will reduce the current you need. So you see here two examples of two families of devices as a function of device diameter and what switching current we need to switch those devices. And you see this nice parabolic dependence, which is basically means the current density remains constant. It varies at the area of the device. And so if you get down to 20 nanometers or so, you can get into few tenths of microamp range, which is start to be interesting in terms of applications. The second aspect of this mechanism of spin transfer torque writing is that the current is inversely proportional to the pulse width. The faster you go, the more current you need. And this is, again, a consequence of this conservation of spin angular momentum, where basically you need to bring in enough Bohr magneton, enough electrons to transfer their spin to switch the magnetization. So the faster you go, the more electrons you need, basically. And you see here, this is the example of the voltage you need or current. It's kind of resistive device, so we can use this more or less in the same manner. And you see this 1 over pulse length kind of dependence. And particularly when you get way below 10 nanosecond time scale, the current increases quite a bit. So that's something we have to live with if we want to make fast devices. Couple more trade-offs I need to discuss. And important trade-off is that the write current is a function actually of the data retention of the energy barrier of the device. And the proportionality factor, it's called the spin transfer torque efficiency, which we express typically in a number of kBT, number of thermal energy you can write per microamp. So this means that basically if you can very much tailor your device for data retention or for power consumption, you want very high data retention, there's a good chance we'll pay the price in terms of current. So again, it's good and bad. It's very flexible. Of course, one of the big challenges is to get this number as high as we can. So we can actually write very stable device with very low current. And the final thing I wanted to mention is that the writing is probabilistic. And this can be understood because basically you need the polarizer to exert a torque on the free layer. And if those two layers are exactly parallel, there will be no torque. So it will take basically forever to get the switching started. So what we rely on is actually thermal fluctuation of one of the layers to kick in, to initiate the switching. So by definition, this will be stochastic. So of course, we can get to very deep error rate, but there is by nature probabilistic switching going on here. So this may mean that you actually always will need ECC in this kind of devices. It's what all the industry is actually saying nowadays. Error correction code. Okay, that's pretty much it for the device part. So I want to say a few words about the integration and how we can make those devices into entire chips, and do chip testing and have actually working chips. So here is two pictures of a test chip we developing at TDK Headway, which is not state-of-the-art CMOS. It's 19 nanometer CMOS, which is quite old technology nowadays, but all the architecture is very much similar to what you would have for more advanced nodes. So basically, we have a bit cell, which is made of one MTJ, the MTJ device I was telling you about just now, and one access transistor, which is used basically to address the device in a cross-point architecture. So the bit cell is one transistor, one MTJ. We can have about 50 F square, so F being the lithographic feature, 19 nanometer cell size, which is to be compared, let's say, with other technology. This is a useful quantifier. This chip also has all the bells and whistles you need to do some testing, so sense amplifier for reading, redundancy, 2-bit ECC, and so on and so forth. So the MTJ comes in the so-called backend of line. It's not, it's built on top of the CMOS, basically. So the CMOS is built in foundries, typically, and you can add the MTJ as added layer on top of the CMOS. This is actually one of the strengths of this technology, is that it's pretty simple to add this after the typically metal-free in the structure. Here you see cross-sectional TEMs, again, of a fully integrated device. And you just need basically 3 masks to do that. So one for the bottom electrode, one for the MTJ, one for the top electrode. It's very simple in terms of integration compared to, let's say, embedded flash, which required more than 10 masks. So for many, for cost purposes, it's quite interesting. It's also, the MTJ stack can also be made fairly thin, so it can be easily integrated between different logic layers. So we've been through a lot of development to demonstrate the viability of this technology, and one thing we had to go through is demonstrate a very low defect rate, which basically, if the defect rate becomes too high, your redundancy won't be able to take care of it, and your chips will be basically not functional. So that will be typically part of the yield, and certainly bad yield I guess is the kiss of death for technology. So here we show a quantile plot, basically a distribution of device resistance or read currents, and you see that we can get below 1 part per million, where we start seeing devices exiting the main distribution. So in a quantile plot, you see this last straight line corresponding to a Gaussian distribution, and then you have a few, in this case, 4 errors, 4 defects, which you can, at this level, it's fairly easy to correct using redundancy. Another thing we need for embedded application is to be able to sustain whatever the people in the fabs want to use for their process. And unfortunately, they want to use fairly high temperature for the low-K dielectric they put on top of between their layers. And basically, the MTJ structure has to be able to withstand a very, very long anneal at 400 C. And this is, I discussed the very thin layers we have. So we have these atomically thin layers, which you need to anneal like crazy for hours. And there's something called diffusion, obviously, which all these things we want to intermix and move into each other and so on and so forth. So keeping the properties of the material of the device when you do all this annealing is actually quite a big challenge. It was a lot of work to get there, but we managed to do it. So this requires basically very, very thorough engineering of everything, all the way from the bottom electrode to the hard mask, including the encapsulation and all the layers in between. But basically, this shows a device which can actually, after 2 hours and 30 minutes annealing, can still retain perfect properties, 2 well-defined states, nice coercivity, which means nice data retention. So basically, when you've done all that, we can demonstrate error-free writing. So this is a typical error count as a function of bitline voltage, which is basically your write current. And you see that if you apply large enough voltage, you can write without any error. In this given instance, down to 6 nanoseconds, which is reasonably fast. And this chip actually has quite decent data retention too. We can get about 10 years, 1 ppm at 142 C, which is quite reasonable. We can also operate these chips at various temperatures. So here, this is something we published in VLSI a few years ago, and where you see basically the error rate as a function of, in a color map as a function of pulse length, so for 4.5 to 10 nanoseconds. And in the y-axis is your write voltage, your bitline voltage. And you see you start from very large number of errors when you don't write, basically, and you crank up the voltage all the time. You see this 1 over kind of, you see that if you reduce the pulse length, you need more voltage, as I was saying before. It's one of the characteristics of spin transfer torque. But if you manage to have high enough voltage and long enough pulse, you can write without any errors in this entire range, minus 25 C to 125 C. If you add error correction code, you can even improve your margin a little bit as expected. So this is basically demonstrating that this technology can work at chip level with all the attributes of actually working chip. So now I'm going to move on to the last part of my talk, which is how this technology actually fits into the entire emerging memory landscape, which you may have heard about. So typically, people show this kind of slides where you have all the technology lined up against established technologies. So in this case, spin transfer torque MRAM, phase change memory, resistive RAM, versus SRAM, DRAM, and flash, NAND. So you have all the characteristics, with in green the good ones, in red the bad ones. So typically, STT-MRAM has always been seen as non-volatile for sure, high endurance, which is not the case, let's say, for PCM or ARM, and relatively high writing speed. The issue is mostly the cost. It's still a pretty big device compared to, let's say, of course, compared to DRAM or flash. But this is maybe a bit too, this is for standalone, by the way, so I took this from a market research company called Yole, which is based in France. But this is a bit maybe too generic. So it turns out that, as I said, the device is very flexible. You can tune the device to make it more faster, to make it have a higher data retention. So actually, we kind of need to look at what kind of application you're looking for. So for example, for standalone application, typically DRAM replacement, what really matters is the bit cell size, on the size of the chip, on the density, basically. But on the other hand, if you look at, let's say, what these people call unified non-volatile memory, typically eFlash replacement, retention will be paramount. On the cell size, maybe, and the chip size won't be all that important. So in between, you've got the so-called working RAM or some kind of low SRAM kind of EDRAM or low speed SRAM kind of application, but the speed might be more important, endurance a bit less, Density certainly still be important. So, but at the end of the day, of course, what really matters is the cost. If the technology is not competitive with whatever exists, even if it's significantly better, nobody really will adopt it except in maybe very niche applications. So it's interesting in this context to think of what the cost actually, what does it mean? What the cost of the memory will come from? And it's basically directly related to the density on cell size. The bigger the cell, the more expensive it is. And it turns out that the current we have available to write those devices is also proportional to the cell size, because the bigger the transistor, the more current you have. So if you don't have much space to fit your cell, you're going to have very little current available and very little space. So typically, talking about standalone DRAM, I kind of lost my pointer, but the cell size is about 4F squared. Nowadays, F, so the lithographic feature is what, 14 nanometers, 10 nanometers, something like that, moving on rapidly to sub 10 nanometers. So you end up having a device which has to be somewhere around the range of 20 nanometers and only 20 microamp to write this thing. On top of that, you have very small devices, so distributions are going to be an issue. And to compensate for distribution, we need a very large on-off ratio, very large for us at least, on-off ratio for readout. So this is fairly difficult, and all the companies who are actually working on that have kind of given up, not quite given up, but kind of given up, because at this point, it's really non-competitive. However, if you look into the embedded flash or DRAM kind of segment, things becomes much more favorable for MRAM, because the cell size we have to work with is actually quite bigger. It's about 50 F squared maybe. So we're talking about MTJ size devices which can be somewhere between 40 and 100 nanometers, write current of the order of 100 microamp or so. And distributions are much easier to deal with because devices are bigger, so it's easier to have less variability from device to device. So we can live with a read signal of just only maybe a factor of 2 on-off ratio or so. So we believe, and we were kind of early believers of this picture that embedded STT-MRAM is the way to go, and pretty much everybody has kind of jumped on board now, including Samsung, including TSMC, even Global Foundry. So basically, we have all the advantages compared to the other technologies. It's very simple layout, very few added mask layer. It's very compatible with back-end offline processes compared, for example, with EDRAM, which is a very complicated process and quite not very friendly. We can, as I said, have all the attributes you want for speed, non-volatility, infinite endurance. So basically, it can be seen as a not quite universal memory in the sense that you will need to tailor your memory for your application, but it's capable of doing pretty much everything. And it's actually very suitable for all the mobile and IoT application where you need instant on and very low duty cycle, because we have the data attention, so we don't really need to put power in there to keep the data. So that's actually quite exciting for this type of IoT applications. And to conclude my talk, I want to maybe the biggest opportunity for this technology as an embedded technology is really the SRAM replacement. SRAM is 6 transistors on chips, so it's a pretty big device, and it's difficult to scale because you have interconnects between the different transistors, and those interconnects don't scale. So basically, you see, this is a chart from Samsung, so you see when you advance in the technology nodes, your device should basically scale as the technology node to the square at the area. So from 22 nanometer to 10 nanometer, you should expect about factor of 5 reduction, but actual scaling of the device is only factor of 2. So basically, the device gets bigger relatively to the actual technology node. So which is why when you look at the amount of memory versus CPU into a high-performance CPU, the amount of memory is in green here is increasing dramatically because these devices basically don't scale. In our case, we believe that even though we cannot get to the super high speed of SRAM, we can certainly be competitive for last level cache applications, which are the biggest amount of memory. Our very compact one transistor, one MTJ design is very scalable, and we can actually write those devices very fast. So here I show error count as a function of bit line voltage, and we can get down to 1.5 nanoseconds without any error. So this is becoming quite competitive with this kind of SRAM, and there's a lot of excitement for advanced nodes. So which brings me to my summaries. So we believe that STT-MRAM combine all the attributes for very, very useful embedded memory devices. And we are at the stage where working chip has been demonstrated. All the foundries, the biggest foundries, are actually jumping on board and have announced production very soon, probably at the end of the year or next year. So we are actually collaborating with TSMC for that. Of course, we're not quite there yet for all the applications, in particular for standalone applications, since we still need to improve quite a bit of things, like the writing efficiency, the read margin, the process control is also a challenge. But as soon as we can get into foundries, these things will improve very exponentially, given the power of these big foundries to actually optimize things. So to just finish, this is a slide from Intel, an advertisement from Intel back in the 1970s, where this is the end when the core memories lost the price war against the emerging CMOS technology. So we believe that we may be close to a comeback of magnetic random access memories, at least for embedded applications. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Questions for Luc? There'll be a quiz after the talk, at the end of the conference, by the way. No questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.